3 months ago, I wrapped a simple branch with sphagnum moss and plastic. Today, I'm about to reveal what happened underneath that wrapping. The transformation you're about to see demonstrates why air layering succeeds where cuttings fail for challenging species like camellias, magnolias, rubber trees, and weeping figs, while traditional cuttings struggle to establish roots without the parent plant's support system. This branch has been receiving constant water and nutrients throughout the entire rooting process. The before and after results will show you exactly why professional propagators consider this technique superior for woody ornamentals that consistently defeat conventional propagation methods. Most home gardeners reach for their pruning shears when they want to clone a prized plant, confident that a simple cutting represents the fastest path to propagation success. This assumption contains a critical biological flaw that dooms many woody cutting attempts before they begin. The moment you sever a branch from its parent plant, you eliminate the continuous vascular connection that delivers water from roots to leaves and transports photosynthetic sugars from leaves to growing tissues. Without an established root system, it must rely entirely on stored carbohydrates and moisture within its tissues, while simultaneously channeling those limited resources toward developing an entirely new root network from scratch. This biological contradiction creates an energy deficit that most cuttings cannot overcome. Traditional cutting propagation struggles with woody ornamental species because the severed branch enters a race against time it rarely wins. Within hours of separation, the cambium layer, the growing tissue just beneath the bark, begins dehydrating as transpiration continues through the leaves. While no replacement water enters through non-existent roots, the cutting must now perform two competing functions, maintaining basic metabolic processes to prevent death while redirecting precious carbohydrate reserves toward root development. This process unfolds like a biological emergency response. The cutting's cambium cells attempt to form callus tissue at the cut surface while simultaneously trying to differentiate into root structures. These competing demands drain the branch's finite energy stores faster than photosynthesis can replenish them, particularly since the stressed cutting often experiences reduced photosynthetic efficiency due to water stress. Professional nurseries understand these fundamental limitations and invest heavily in specialized equipment to artificially overcome them. Automated misting systems maintain leaf moisture by supplementing the absent root water uptake. Rooting hormone applications attempt to stimulate faster root development. Even with these technological interventions, woody species like magnolias demonstrate why cutting propagation remains unreliable for many valuable ornamentals. Established fruit trees present perhaps the greatest cutting propagation challenge. The lignified tissues of mature apple or cherry branches contain natural rooting inhibitors that evolved to prevent opportunistic sprouting. Commercial orchards propagate these varieties through complex grafting procedures rather than attempting cutting propagation, acknowledging the biological barriers that make direct cloning nearly impossible. The fundamental weakness lies in the severed connection between photosynthetic production and root development zones. In an intact plant, leaves produce carbohydrates that travel through the phloem transport system directly to root zones where they fuel continuous growth and expansion. Cuttings break this connection, creating isolated biological systems that must function independently without the integrated support network that sustains normal plant development. Air layering eliminates this critical weakness by maintaining the parent plant's complete life support system throughout the entire rooting process. This approach transforms the biological dynamics from a survival crisis into a controlled root development process. While woody cuttings struggle to achieve consistent success rates even under optimal conditions, air layering techniques consistently deliver success rates above 85% for the same species. This improvement occurs because the developing clone never experiences the energy deficit and water stress that kills traditional cuttings. Understanding this fundamental difference explains why ancient propagators developed air layering techniques thousands of years before modern rooting hormones and misting systems existed. They recognized that working with plant biology, rather than against it, produces superior results. The parent plant becomes an active partner in the cloning process, providing continuous support until the new root system achieves independence. The key lies in understanding how plants naturally move and concentrate their energy resources, and how we can redirect this flow to trigger root formation exactly where we want it. Air layering succeeds by manipulating the plant's internal transport network to redirect energy flow toward root development at a precise location. Every woody plant operates through two distinct vascular systems that function like separate highway networks within the stem. The xylem tissue, located beneath the bark in the inner wood, carries water and dissolved minerals upward from the root zone to the leaves where photosynthesis occurs. The phloem tissue, positioned just under the bark above the xylem, transports the carbohydrates and sugars produced by photosynthesis downward from the leaves to feed the roots and support new growth throughout the plant. Girdling disrupts this transport equilibrium by strategically removing only the phloem tissue, while preserving the xylem completely intact. When you remove that 1-inch ring of bark, cambium, and phloem around the branch circumference, you sever the downward carbohydrate highway while maintaining the upward water supply route. The xylem continues delivering water and nutrients to the leaves above the girdle, ensuring the foliage remains healthy and photosynthetically active throughout the rooting process. This selective tissue removal creates a biological traffic jam where photosynthetic products accumulate above the girdled zone. Instead of flowing down to the parent plant's root system, the leaves continue producing sugars, starches, and growth hormones through normal photosynthesis. But these energy-rich compounds become trapped at the girdle site because their transport pathway has been eliminated. The result resembles a dam backing up water flow, except here, carbohydrates concentrate at the treatment area in ever-increasing concentrations. This dramatic accumulation provides the concentrated energy source necessary to fuel the cellular division and differentiation required for root formation. The trapped sugars and starches create optimal conditions for adventitious root development, transforming dormant cambial cells into active root primordia that begin exploring the surrounding environment. The accumulated auxin, a plant hormone normally transported through the phloem, triggers the formation of root initials at the girdle site. This physiological response explains why air layering succeeds with mature, lignified branches that resist traditional cutting propagation. The energy density becomes so high that it overrides the plant's normal resistance to adventitious rooting, forcing root development even in tissues that would never respond to rooting hormones or cutting treatments. The girdling technique transforms the targeted branch into a self-contained root production facility, powered by the parent plant's continued photosynthetic output. The leaves above the girdle maintain full metabolic activity, producing fresh carbohydrates daily that immediately concentrate at the treatment zone, instead of dispersing throughout the plant. This creates a continuous energy supply that sustains root development over the extended time periods required for woody species to establish functional root systems. The precision required for successful girdling reflects the delicate balance between disrupting carbohydrate transport and maintaining branch vitality. The girdle width must prevent phloem regeneration while avoiding damage to the underlying xylem tissue. Too narrow a cut allows the cambium to bridge the gap and restore downward transport, eliminating carbohydrate accumulation. Too wide a cut risks severing xylem vessels, which kills the branch by cutting off water supply to the leaves above. The cambium layer's removal during girdling prevents wound healing that would restore normal transport function. This sustained disruption maintains the biological conditions necessary for root development over the months required for complete root system establishment. Understanding this carbohydrate accumulation process reveals why air layering achieves such reliable results compared to traditional propagation methods. The technique harnesses the plant's own energy production system to power clone development, creating optimal rooting conditions that overcome the biological barriers that defeat conventional cutting approaches. The success of this entire process depends entirely on executing that initial girdle with absolute precision. The knife blade becomes your primary instrument for achieving the millimeter-level accuracy that separates successful air layering from costly failures. Professional propagators begin with careful branch selection, targeting healthy growth from the previous growing season, with diameters ranging from pencil thickness to thumb thickness. These dimensions provide sufficient cambial tissue for root development while maintaining structural integrity throughout the extended rooting period. The girdling cut must measure approximately 1 1/2 inches in width, a measurement that balances competing biological requirements with surgical precision. This width prevents phloem regeneration during the months required for root establishment, yet remains narrow enough to allow healing if the air layering attempt fails. Narrower cuts permit the cambium layer to bridge the gap and restore downward carbohydrate transport, eliminating the accumulation that drives root formation. Wider cuts risk weakening the branch structure and may damage the underlying xylem vessels that maintain water transport to the foliage above. Using a sharp, sterile knife, make the first circumferential cut around the branch, penetrating through the bark layer into the cambium beneath. The blade must slice cleanly through these outer tissues without gouging or tearing, which can damage the critical xylem layer below. Position the second cut exactly 1 1/2 inches below the first, maintaining parallel alignment to ensure uniform tissue removal across the branch circumference. The precision of these parallel cuts determines whether the girdling achieves complete phloem disruption or leaves gaps that allow continued transport. Between these two cuts lies the bark, cambium, and phloem tissue that must be completely removed to create carbohydrate accumulation. Use the knife blade to score the bark vertically between the cuts, then carefully peel away the tissue strips with your fingers or the knife tip. The removal process requires patience and attention. Rushing this step often results in gouging the xylem or leaving cambium fragments that regenerate transport connections. The critical indicator of successful girdling appears as smooth, white xylem wood beneath the removed tissue layers. This exposed wood surface must remain completely intact and undamaged to maintain water transport to the leaves above the treatment site. Many beginners commit the fatal error of cutting too deep, severing xylem vessels and immediately killing everything above the girdle. The branch wilts within days as water transport ceases, eliminating any possibility of root development. Equally problematic cuts that penetrate too shallow leave remnants of green cambium tissue clinging to the exposed surface. This residual growing tissue quickly regenerates, bridging the gap between the upper and lower bark sections and restoring downward phloem transport. Within weeks, the wound heals over and carbohydrate accumulation ceases, preventing root initiation despite months of waiting. The properly executed girdle reveals xylem that appears uniformly white without any traces of green tissue remaining on the exposed surface. The removed bark strip should peel away cleanly in continuous sections, indicating complete separation of the cambium layer from the underlying wood. Any green coloration on the exposed xylem surface signals incomplete cambium removal and requires additional careful scraping to eliminate remaining growing tissue. Professional propagators inspect the girdled surface under magnification to confirm complete tissue removal before proceeding with the wrapping process. The smooth, white xylem surface should show no gouges, tears, or remaining bark fragments that could compromise either water transport or carbohydrate accumulation. Timing significantly influences the success of the girdling process. Early spring operations, utilizing last season's growth, or late summer procedures with current year's growth, provide optimal conditions for tissue separation and subsequent root development. During these periods, active cambial division facilitates cleaner bark removal and establishes ideal physiological conditions for carbohydrate accumulation. A properly executed girdle establishes the precise biological conditions necessary for concentrated carbohydrate accumulation and subsequent root formation. This technical precision transforms a simple branch into a controlled root production facility that operates continuously until complete root system establishment occurs. The exposed xylem surface now awaits the construction of its protective rooting environment. Constructing the optimal rooting environment becomes the critical next phase that determines whether months of patience yield vigorous root development or disappointing failure. The rooting medium must balance two competing requirements that challenge most propagation attempts, maintaining consistent moisture levels while providing adequate aeration for cellular respiration and root expansion. Sphagnum moss emerges as the superior rooting medium because its fibrous structure creates countless air pockets while simultaneously absorbing substantial amounts of water. This dual capacity addresses the fundamental challenge facing developing roots, which require both oxygen for metabolic processes and consistent moisture for cellular division and elongation. The moss fibers create a three-dimensional matrix that holds water molecules while maintaining air spaces between the strands. Achieving optimal moisture content requires precise technique that separates successful propagators from those who experience root rot or desiccation failures. Submerge the sphagnum moss completely in water until every fiber reaches saturation. Then squeeze the moss firmly between your hands until water drips steadily but not in streams. This moisture level indicates the ideal balance, where water availability remains high, while excess moisture that promotes fungal development has been eliminated. The properly moistened moss should feel damp throughout, but not sodden when compressed. Oversaturated moss creates anaerobic conditions where beneficial soil organisms cannot survive, while harmful fungi proliferate rapidly. These fungal pathogens attack the developing root primordia before they can establish protective barriers, causing the entire air layering attempt to fail. Despite perfect girdling technique, wrap the prepared moss around the girdled area, creating a uniform layer that extends at least 1 inch beyond both the upper and lower cut edges. This extended coverage ensures that root development occurs within the moss environment rather than attempting to grow into exposed air or bark surfaces. The moss layer thickness should measure approximately 2 inches around the circumference, providing adequate volume for extensive root system development. Pack the moss firmly against the exposed xylem surface while maintaining its loose, fibrous structure. Excessive compression eliminates the air spaces necessary for root respiration, while insufficient contact fails to provide the intimate moisture contact required for root initiation. The moss should conform closely to the girdled surface contours without creating dense, impermeable sections. Clear plastic wrap transforms this moss environment into a controlled humidity chamber that maintains optimal conditions regardless of external weather fluctuations. The plastic barrier prevents moisture loss through evaporation while allowing visual monitoring of root development progress throughout the extended rooting period. Stretch the plastic tightly around the moss bundle, eliminating air pockets that could create dry zones where root development stalls. Professional propagators select plastic wrap thickness that provides durability without restricting root expansion as the developing system grows. The wrap must remain flexible enough to accommodate root growth while maintaining its barrier properties for months of exposure to temperature variations and handling during monitoring sessions. Light exclusion becomes critical for preventing algae growth within the humid moss environment, particularly in sunny locations. Covering the clear plastic with aluminum foil creates darkness that prevents photosynthetic organisms from competing with developing roots for nutrients and oxygen. The foil covering also provides thermal insulation that moderates temperature fluctuations, which can stress developing root systems. Secure both ends of the plastic wrap using electrical tape or heavy-duty twist ties that maintain their grip strength throughout prolonged exposure periods. The sealing system must prevent moisture loss at the connection points while allowing some flexibility for thermal expansion and contraction cycles. Create overlapping seals that extend beyond the moss boundaries, ensuring complete environmental isolation. The completed wrapping system functions like a miniature greenhouse that replicates ideal soil conditions while maintaining visibility for progress assessment. Internal humidity levels remain consistently high without the daily misting requirements that traditional cutting propagation demands. The self-contained environment operates independently of external weather conditions, eliminating the environmental stress factors that cause traditional cutting failures. This controlled microclimate sustains root development through seasonal variations and temporary neglect periods that would kill conventional cuttings within days. The biological advantage of maintained parent plant support, combined with optimal rooting conditions, creates propagation success rates that exceed traditional methods by substantial margins across diverse woody species. Within this sealed environment, the transformation begins immediately, though the first visible signs require weeks of patient observation. Experienced propagators know exactly which visual cues signal successful root development versus potential failure during the extended monitoring period. Root formation begins gradually over the first several weeks after wrapping completion, though woody ornamental species often require 2 to 4 months depending on their natural rooting characteristics and seasonal timing. The extended time frame reflects the complex cellular processes occurring within the moss chamber, as accumulated carbohydrates trigger cambial division and root primordia formation. The first signs of successful root development appear as microscopic white bumps called root primordia that emerge at the upper edge of the girdle where carbohydrate concentrations reach maximum density. These tiny formations develop gradually from the cambial tissue that remains active above the girdled zone, responding to the concentrated sugars and growth hormones trapped by the phloem disruption. Early primordia measure less than 1 millimeter in diameter and require careful observation through the clear plastic to detect their presence against the moss background. Over subsequent weeks, these primordia elongate into recognizable white root structures that begin actively exploring the moss environment in search of moisture and nutrients. The developing roots appear bright white against the darker moss matrix, creating stark visual contrast that makes progress monitoring straightforward even through multiple plastic layers. Initial root growth proceeds slowly as the cellular machinery establishes the metabolic pathways necessary for independent nutrient absorption and water uptake. Healthy root system development follows a predictable architectural pattern that distinguishes successful air layering from random cellular activity. Primary roots emerge first from the primordia sites, extending directly outward from the girdled surface into the surrounding moss medium. These primary structures establish the foundation for subsequent branching as secondary roots develop along the length of the initial growth, creating the network density required for effective nutrient absorption once separation occurs. The branching process accelerates dramatically once primary roots reach sufficient length to support additional growth points. Secondary root formation creates the fibrous network that transforms the moss ball from a simple rooting medium into a dense, interconnected system capable of sustaining independent plant growth. This secondary development phase produces the visual density that signals readiness for separation from the parent plant. Brown or black discoloration within the moss environment indicates serious fungal contamination that threatens the entire air layering process. These color changes typically appear first at the moisture accumulation points where excess water creates anaerobic conditions favorable to pathogenic organisms. Fungal development can spread rapidly through the sealed environment, attacking both the developing roots and the girdled tissue before establishing protective barriers. Dried moss sections signal seal failure that compromises the controlled humidity essential for root development. The desiccated areas appear lighter in color and lose their fibrous structure as moisture content drops below the threshold required for cellular activity. Seal failures often result from temperature fluctuations that cause plastic expansion and contraction, creating gaps that allow moisture escape and environmental contamination. Professional propagators recognize that root development velocity increases exponentially once initial establishment occurs. A few visible white roots can multiply into extensive networks within weeks as the metabolic machinery reaches full operational capacity. This acceleration phase represents the transition from survival mode to active growth, indicating that carbohydrate accumulation has reached sufficient levels to support rapid cellular division and elongation. The moss ball texture provides tactile confirmation of root development progress when visual assessment proves inconclusive due to dense root masses or plastic condensation. Successfully rooted systems create firmness throughout the moss medium as root networks bind the fibers together into a cohesive mass. This structural integrity contrasts sharply with the loose, compressible texture of moss containing only failed root attempts or fungal contamination. Clear visual confirmation to the plastic wrap, combined with firm moss ball texture, indicates that separation time has arrived. The root system density at this stage provides sufficient infrastructure to support independent growth once the clone receives its own water and nutrient supply. Dense white root masses visible against the plastic surface demonstrate that the biological transformation from dependent branch to independent plant has reached completion. This visual and tactile assessment eliminates uncertainty about harvest timing, while ensuring that separation occurs when the developing clone possesses maximum survival potential. The moment of truth approaches as your successfully rooted clone prepares to abandon its protected environment and face the challenges of independent existence. Executing the separation requires surgical precision and immediate transition protocols that determine whether months of careful development culminate in propagation success or devastating failure. Preparation becomes critical before making any cuts, requiring a pot filled with well-draining potting mix positioned nearby to receive the separated plant immediately after harvesting. The potting medium should combine peat moss, perlite, and vermiculite in proportions that retain moisture while preventing waterlogged conditions that stress newly independent root systems. The separation cut demands surgical precision, using sharp, sterile pruning shears that slice cleanly through the branch below the root mass without crushing or tearing the parent plant's remaining tissue. Position the shears approximately 2 inches below the lowest visible roots to ensure complete root system capture while leaving adequate healing tissue on the parent branch. The cutting angle should create a clean surface that promotes rapid callus formation and prevents pathogen entry into the parent plant's vascular system. Remove the plastic wrapping with extreme care to preserve the delicate moss ball structure that protects the newly formed roots from their first exposure to dry air. These roots have developed within a controlled humidity environment and lack the protective, waxy coatings that mature root systems develop through gradual environmental exposure. The moss ball provides essential moisture retention and physical protection during the critical transition period when root shock can kill the entire clone within hours. Gently position the intact moss ball into the prepared pot, ensuring the root mass sits at the proper depth where the original girdling site aligns with the soil surface level. The surrounding potting mix should contact the moss ball without compressing it, allowing air circulation while maintaining moisture contact with the developing root network. Firm the soil gently around the moss ball perimeter, eliminating air pockets that could cause root desiccation while avoiding compression that restricts root expansion. The newly separated clone enters a critical establishment phase where cellular machinery must adapt from receiving continuous parent plant support to functioning independently through its own root system. This transition resembles switching from intravenous feeding to normal digestion. The infrastructure exists, but requires time to achieve full operational capacity. During this period, the clone remains extremely vulnerable to environmental stresses that established plants tolerate easily. Position the potted clone in bright, indirect light conditions that provide adequate energy for photosynthesis without subjecting the stress-sensitive foliage to intense radiation that increases water loss through transpiration. Direct sunlight during the establishment period often overwhelms the developing root system's capacity to replace lost moisture, causing irreversible wilting even when soil moisture remains adequate. Maintain consistent soil moisture levels without overwatering, as saturated conditions prevent oxygen access to roots that are still developing their protective barriers against anaerobic pathogens. Professional propagators employ humidity domes or clear plastic bag tents during the initial establishment weeks to ease the transition from the sealed air layering environment to normal atmospheric conditions. These protective coverings maintain elevated humidity around the foliage while gradually acclimating the plant to lower moisture levels through controlled ventilation increases. The gradual transition prevents shock that occurs when newly rooted plants encounter sudden humidity drops. Monitor the separated clone closely for transplant shock symptoms that indicate adaptation difficulties during the establishment process. Initial leaf wilting, or limited leaf drop, represents normal stress responses as the plant adjusts its water balance to match the new root system's absorption capacity. However, new growth emergence from terminal buds signals successful establishment and indicates that the root system has achieved sufficient functionality to support active metabolism and growth. The establishment timeline typically requires approximately 4 to 6 weeks before the clone demonstrates vigorous, independent growth and can receive standard plant care protocols, though this period can vary significantly based on species characteristics and environmental conditions. During this period, avoid fertilizer applications that can burn developing root tips and maintain protection from temperature extremes that stress the adapting plant. This meticulous transition process transforms months of patient air layering work into a thriving, independent plant that carries forward the exact genetic makeup of its parent. The careful attention to separation timing and establishment conditions determines whether the biological investment yields a vigorous clone that validates the superiority of this ancient propagation methodology. Air layering transforms plant propagation from uncertain gambling into controlled scientific methodology, delivering genetic clones through reliable biological principles that traditional cutting approaches struggle to match. When you encounter prized specimens, whether century-old camellias or productive fruit trees, you possess the knowledge to create identical copies while preserving the original plant's integrity. The technique works because the developing clone receives continuous support from the parent plant until robust root systems establish complete independence. Master this precision girdling and wrapping methodology, and you eliminate the heartbreak of watching valuable cuttings fail when guaranteed success awaits through patient air layering execution. Start with branches you already plan to prune, reducing any risk while gaining practical experience with this ancient propagation science.